Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second Jagiellonian Interdisciplinary Security Conference. Friends, foes, and familiar strangers, reassessing activeness in times of the global disorder. Well, the title of the conference was inspired, partially at least, by Stanley Milgram's archetypes of dominant patterns of behavior, and I think that we would be particularly excited to use them for the purpose of analyzing and assessing performance in domestic and international politics, security, in contemporary turbulent global security system. I hope that the concept of friends, foes, and strangers will stimulate debate on contemporary activeness in the complex security environment. I will be particularly interested in examining security actors' differentiation according their status, roles, performed in selected security fields. Well, on behalf of the organizing committee, as the chairman of the group, I would like to welcome you, to invite you to participate actively in the debates. Our conference, as you have probably noticed, is not a big one, but I think it's better. Well, recently I took part in a World Congress with 2,000 participants, and it was well, a bit sometimes disappointing because of the lack of time and quiet to reflect upon problems, issues that we deal with or in our contemporary and everyday activities. But during 2 days of debates, we'll have diversity of topics with interdisciplinary approaches represented in the program. We have a keynote lecture which will be given by Professor Christopher Coker, an eminent scholar from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And I believe that fruitful debate among experts and scholars will give a unique opportunity to challenge traditional views on the problems of global order and international security. Well, I would like to gratefully acknowledge patronage, honorary patronage of His Magnificence Rector of the Jagiellonian University, Professor Wojciech Nowak. I also thank Professor Zdzisław Mach, Dean of the Faculty of International Political Studies. I also thank Professor Paweł Leidler, Vice Dean for Educational Affairs, representing these authorities for organizational and financial support of this event. Also, I want to gratefully acknowledge the honorary patronage of the mayor of the city of Krakow, Professor Jacek Majchrowski, who also generously sponsored the gala dinner tomorrow. Okay, now I would like to ask Professor Paweł Leidler to open officially this conference on behalf of deemed authorities of the Faculty of International and Political Studies. Professor Dean, please, take the floor.
Thank you, Professor Gruszczak. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really honored to stand in front of you in the name of the Dean of the Faculty of International and Political Studies, Professor Zdzisław Mach, who could not be present today, but he asked me for a couple of introductory remarks, plus, of course, a very honorary opening of the second Jagiellonian Security Conference. As you all notice, it's the second conference. I remember the first one. It was a big success. But when you organize something for the first time, you never know whether there will be potential for next meetings. As you can see, probably the most active part of our Faculty of International and Political Studies, a part of the Institute of Political Science and International Relations, the chair of National Security, Studies, headed by Professor Artur Gruszczak, is capable not only of organizing another event, but also another successful event. I'm aware, probably not as a member of the faculty or the member of the university, but as an ordinary citizen, that the issues of security are of interest of anyone, various types of security issues. And what is really important when you look into the program of that conference, that it's interdisciplinary. And this interdisciplinarity you can see not only in the title of the conference, but also in various panels. I noticed that there are not only political scientists, international relations experts, and generally security studies experts, but there are also lawyers, sociologists, and even cultural studies experts. And I think that's very good for the discussion that will be held, and also for, as I believe it always is, a result for a book that will come later as the publication, as the effect of your fruitful discussions. I wish you a silent time, meaning that you'll have small panels, but I fully agree with Professor Gruszczak, sometimes also visiting conferences of 2,000 or even more people and not being even aware who's the participant. You have a chance to know and listen to most of the panelists, and you have a chance to have even more of a kind of a seminar or workshop, which will be of a greater even value than a typical conference. I wish you all the best, and once again, congratulations from Dean and me to Professor Gruszczak and the whole chair of national security, a group of people that we can always count on, not only from conferential perspectives, but also from scientific perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean, for his official opening words and for very kind words. Well, we are just beginning. We are on the beginning, but well, you all are well aware that this is not my personal contribution to the organization, but we have the whole team of scholars and the students engaged in this event, volunteers, also my colleagues from the Department of National Security, as well as the section of the conference organization of Jagiellonian University responsible for, let's say, logistical issues. So thank you very much for your job and for your contribution. Well, I think that the extraordinary part of this meeting, of this conference, is the presence of Professor Christopher Coker, an internationally renowned war scholar, outstanding military conflicts expert, professor of international relations at the Department of International Relations, London School of Economics and Political Science, prolific author. Well, I think that we, scholars of war, conflict, security studies, but also international relations, we read plenty of Professor, several dozen books which he already has published during his academic career. Just let me mention the latest one, Rebooting Clausewitz, last year, the book Future War, Improbable War, China, US, and the Logical Great Power War, and many, many others. Well, Professor Coker was recently appointed the head of LSE Ideas, which is a foreign policy think tank at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Coker's long career included fellowship with NATO. He also served 2 terms on the Council of the Royal United Services Institute. He advised several Conservative Party think tanks, and he's regular lecturer at the Royal College of Defence Studies in London, NATO Defence College in Rome, Center for International Security, Geneva, National Institute for Defence Studies, like many others. Professor Kokel will give a keynote speech on robots, ethics, and the human agency of the world. Professor, the floor is yours. It's our pleasure and honor to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you. And the title of this conference, Friends, Foes, or Strangers, is actually very apt for what I want to talk about today, which will be about artificial intelligence and the so-called killer robots that may be appearing on battlefields quite soon. It's a term that has gained general currency. It's much in use by the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross. And the main theme of this conference, obviously, is human agency. And so the question I want to raise is the extent to which our agency will be revalued or devalued by artificial intelligence, looking specifically at war. Now, war produces new agents all the time. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have imagined the existence of cyber warriors, people who hack into our computer systems across the world, nearly all of them, interestingly, men. Cubicle warriors, as the Americans call drone pilots, 50% these days are, interestingly, women. But these are not the agents that I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about a new, intelligent, autonomous set of beings on the battlefields of the future. And to ask this question, whether they are going to reduce human agency or enhance human agency. And I'm asking this question, of course, all of us in this room have been following the debate about artificial intelligence, and that's how that's going to change the world around us. When I think of war, I think of a comment by T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, who said that war was the ultimate human activity because it involved human qualities such as willpower, such as courage, such as expertise, such as creativity. He called these the irrational tenth in war, which he added could only be secured by instinct sharpened by thought. Well, robots, of course, will have no instincts as such, but they will have thoughts, and that seems to be a troubling problem for many people. Back in the 1930s, the German playwright Bertolt Brecht wrote a poem. It has these lines: "General, we already have a handy little gadget called a man. He can fly a plane, he can kill, but he has only one defect: he can think." There are two schools of thought here. Some believe that robots of the future won't be able to think through the consequences of their actions, and that will make them dangerous. And others think that the ability to think for themselves is what makes them even more dangerous. So that's the question I pose. Let's go back to basics. What are robots? Robots at the moment, the robots that we encounter in everyday life, personally, or we read about, are tools. And I want to say just something very quickly about tool use. Bruno Latour insists that we are indeed agents precisely because we have tools. Timothy Taylor, professor of prehistory at the University of Vienna, goes so far as to say that tool use led to human consciousness. In fact, we had no human consciousness before the use of tools. It's the other way around from the familiar version, that we got consciousness first and then invented tools. But let's leave that debate to one side. What Latour says, I think, is quite interesting. He's suggesting that sociology should not be about just relationships between people. It should be also the relationships we have between ourselves and the tools we use. In fact, he also poses some interesting questions. If we didn't have a hammer to hammer in a nail, and if we tried to run a company without bookkeeping, could we say we had any agency at all? What tools give us, Latour suggests, is something we wouldn't have without tools: agency. Tools allow, determine, permit, facilitate, render possible or impossible. And he has kind of, in a sense, rewritten our history, as many historians have as well, So the first tools we had were social tools, Machiavellian intelligence, the ability to manipulate other people, to form alliances and alignments. Intellectual tools, such as writing and counting, which made civilization possible. You can't really think of a civilization without those intellectual tools. The machine tools of the Industrial Revolution, which rendered us machines. Back in 19th century Britain, people who worked on looms were called hands. So we can take the argument further. Some historians have come up with the concept of materiality, which is the tool use is a two-way relationship. We use tools and tools use us. And we have to understand this nexus between the two. It's very old, by the way. I mean, historians have talked about materiality in the last 20 years. Plato was talking about it a long time ago, 2,000 years ago. If you read his last book, The Laws, in which he regrets the fact, the cognitive loss involved in moving from an oral culture, in which people had to remember things, to a written culture. And today, I'm sure you're aware, many writers were also talking about the cognitive loss of involved in digital technology. If you take a writer like Nicholas Carr in his book The Shallows, he says that digital technology makes us less sociable. You may have seen a news item last week that 2/3 of American adolescents prefer to talk to each other on screen rather than in person. Makes us less sociable. That's important if agency requires social interaction with other people. The Oxford neuroscientist Susan Greenfield and the American sociologist Sherry Turkle both think that digital technology has reduced our emotional intelligence very significantly. Children in Denmark now, age 9, are having to go to child psychiatrists to learn body language. Because they spend most of their time talking to each other on the screen, they can't interpret each other's body language. And that's absolutely essential, so far in history, for being able to work together in a social relationship. But without taking sides here, what we can say is that digital technology is reshaping our world. It's restructuring our experience of time and place. It's rewiring the neurotransmitter pathways so that we are lighting up reward circuits in our brains, which make people totally addicted to emailing, or makes Donald Trump totally addicted to tweeting. It's a man who literally cannot give that up. He's tried, or rather he hasn't tried, but his cabinet has tried to tell him. So we're all, I think, experiencing something new. Machines are beginning to manage us. We're becoming machine readable all the time. We're being employed increasingly to the degree to which machines can read our emotions and can read our moods. Look at the websites. If you look at internet search websites, they read our minds all the time. And if we're unhappy because they can see we're visiting unhappy websites, the next morning we come into the office, they give something that we think will make us happy. Where to go on holiday next, for example. And drone pilots in my own field, war, now have their biostatistics, their biostats, the heart rhythms and their brain, heart rates and brain rhythms now monitored on a regular basis by computers to see whether they're paying attention to what they're doing or not. And if they fail to pay attention, they can be shut off by the computer. Drone pilots, anyway, may be on the way out. The next generation of drones, we expect, will be autonomous systems that can reprogram themselves without human direction, that can take decisions as to who to target and what to target without human direction or human programming. And most of all, and this I think is the key, they can make judgment calls about ethics, whether it is ethical or not ethical to take out a particular target. Now, in many ways, semi-autonomous systems are already here. They're almost on the cusp of autonomy. An IT company in Hong Kong actually appointed an algorithm onto its main board 2 years ago. We have an AI application that has rendered radiologists unnecessary. It's a company that can look at the lung cancer nodules that you may have far more effectively and far more quickly than human radiologists can. People like myself who write books, as you just heard, there's a company in Chicago called Narrative Science that expects that within a few years, just a few years, journalists will be rendered irrelevant and redundant. A computer algorithm will be able to analyze a story, transcribe a story, edit a story, and transmit a story far more effectively. In other words, the algorithms in a few years' time, not humans, but the algorithms, will be writing articles about our future as well as their own future. So where do we go? If our agency is being rendered redundant increasingly by the prospect of autonomous systems and artificial intelligence, where do we go in war? And I'm sure many of you will know about the killer robots. The idea by the International Committee of the Red Cross and the United Nations, we must stop the killer robots from coming online now while we still have time. A totally hopeless exercise, because we have never in history banned any weapon system that we've wanted to use. And they're already here, by the way. There are 381 semi-autonomous machines that are involved in war already. And a number of countries are at the forefront of deploying them. The United States, for example, has artificial intelligence, anti-ship missile that can determine how to target a target, not yet when to do so, but it can determine how to do so. And these weapon systems are coming online all the time. Let me give you some good news, however. They're not going to become agents for a long time yet. And that's the first thing I want to tell you. Why AI will be an actor, not an agent. And it's important to understand the difference between these two terms. Quite apart from the fact, of course, that technology is never as reliable as we would like it to be. You've heard of the driverless cars. So the driverless cars are wonderful in principle, but in practice, they suffer from many problems. Just one pixel, which is out of sync, can create problems for the actual navigation system. A driverless car, for example, can't tell the difference between a human being and a kangaroo. They tried kangaroos as a very unlikely animal. They can't recognize kangaroos. Face recognition systems, very advanced in many respects, but if I wear a 3D printed mask, they won't be able to tell the difference between me and the person whose face I'm trying to mimic. We can automatically tell the difference between a mask and a human face, however sophisticated the mask may be. But of course the technologies improve all the time. So let's put that to one side. There are three reasons, I think, why machines will be, however smart, will be actors and not agents. The first is that they have no motivation. And that's very important. We are a species that is motivated. We have hardwired into us by natural selection emotions, and instincts, and drives programmed into us to reproduce, essentially. That's the key. But we also, of course, have goals that we set ourselves. We want to win. We want to dominate. We want to control others. Power is the essence of human nature. The power to secure ourselves with people or against other people. And, of course, we also have intelligence, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, and it's there for a reason. We've got to balance these goals of domination and control with life-sustaining goals. In other words, goals which enable us to survive. Motivated intelligence requires social and emotional intelligence. And it requires, above all, our ability to attribute intentions to other people, to read those intentions, understand those intentions, and on that basis to manipulate other people in a positive or negative way. And Daniel Dennett, the American philosopher, has said that motivation is the most important factor that distinguishes from machines. The machines we are building at the moment will have no motives as such, no aims other than those found in their programs. The second thing is machines are not only motivationless, they're also non-teleological. In other words, they don't ask themselves the questions that you and I would ask ourselves if we found ourselves on a battlefield, for example, tomorrow. What's the first thing that a soldier asks on a battlefield? Why am I here? Who put me here in this position to be killed? Am I really willing to die? And if so, what am I willing to die for? Perhaps my country, perhaps a God, perhaps my family, perhaps my friends. All these are aspirational and they're cast in teleological language, and one that produces a sense of purpose, a meaning. We're constantly trying to understand the meaning of our situation and our existence. Now, I think this idea is expressed very well by the American novelist Saul Bellow about one of the characters in one of his most famous novels, Augie Marsh, which won him a Pulitzer Prize, in which a character insists, and I quote, "For God's sake, make use of me, only don't use me without a purpose." And surely, Bellow added in this letter to a friend, the greatest human desire of all is to be useful to others. Because if we're useful to others, we are respected for what we actually do. So a young jihadist who goes off and blows himself up in Syria or Iraq is being useful to others. But a robot that is programmed to self-destruct, to ensure that doesn't fall into the hands of an enemy, is not involved in something called martyrdom. Martyrdom is a gift. It's a choice that you make. It's not part of a robot's social repertoire. And the most important, I think, difference between machines and human beings for the foreseeable future is that we are rational, machines are logical, and there's an enormous difference between the two. And human agency does not rest on logic. It rests on rationality. Now, as Daniel Dennett also tells us, rationality is dangerous for that reason. It leads to some very bad decision-making. And I'm sure you're all aware of the cognitive impairment that rationality produces in all of us. Cognitive dissonance, that's mistaking people's intentions. When they don't mean us harm, we think they are being harmful. Confirmation bias, you make a mistake, you never admit to making that mistake. It's called reinforcement of failure. Premature cognitive closure, that simply means that I'm fed up with arguing you. We've been arguing this point for months, for years. Let's just do something by going to war. That will change the situation one way or the other. Scenario fulfillment. You know all these social, psychological problems that social psychologists have been identifying for years. Interesting thing, I think, about Dennett's work is that he suggests they were not hardwired into us to produce decision-making. They were hardwired into us for social bonding. If you think that we need an enemy and we need a friend to bond together, to feel secure with each other, then mistaking people's intentions serves a very useful social purpose. It's not there to improve decision-making. And I'm afraid we're stuck with the same brains that we had 300,000 years ago, which we've inherited from our Stone Age ancestors. They're the same brains. Nothing in that sense has changed. Now, of course, we do logic as well. Mathematicians spend a lot of their time in a logical world. Chess players, of course. Chess is a game placed on logic. But we're not logical beings. And my favourite illustration of this fact is the famous physicist Niels Bohr, who shouted at one of his students once, "Stop being so bloody logical and start thinking." There's a difference between being logical and thinking. That, by the way, isn't the fiercest remark to have been shouted at a student. I think my favourite example is the man who was part of the Manhattan Project, Robert Oppenheimer, who shouted at a student one day, "You're so young and already you've achieved so little." That really is a cruel remark. You should try it on students one day. You will recall perhaps Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. These are still the key. They've never been better. Asimov produced these laws so that we and robots could coexist together peacefully. They can't be applied in the real world. He spent the rest of his life, the last 20 years of his life, writing short stories, trying to illustrate how his laws of robotics could be applied in our human-built world. And he failed every time. And a computer scientist called Roger Clark published 2 articles in a magazine, computer magazine, in 1993, a year before Asimov died, looking at every single permutation of how these laws might apply in the social world, and discovered they simply couldn't. Not because the robots are stupid, far from it, but because life is not algorithmic. That's the point. The world that we have built for our own agency is not algorithmic, and algorithms cannot navigate it very successfully. Now, of course, we have rules. We have rules like Asimov's rules. They're called moral heuristics. Again, thanks to natural selection. They give us a sense of right and wrong. We have a conscience for that reason. Everybody is born with a conscience. They don't always use it. But the point about our rules is that we break them all the time. We make exceptions for good reasons and bad reasons. And that's what agency is. It is the ability to make exceptions to the rules that we invent. And that is why, as a species, we have something we call moral standing. And agency and ethics go together. The moment you commit yourself to something, you are responsible for the outcome of what you have decided to do. And that's basically what ethics is, consequence management. Are you willing to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions? So let me just say a few remarks about agency and ethics. But before I do so, I make 2 observations. Our life, by the way, is increasingly ethical. I think we live in more ethical times than ever before, not because we're nicer or better than ever before, but because the rules get more and more complex and complicated. Think of the Me Too movement in the last 2 years. Completely new ethical battleground on which the genders and sexes are now fighting. Think of fair trade coffee in supermarkets. If you go into a supermarket now, 30 years ago, people didn't have to say that they were selling products that had been produced ethically. Now they have to. Think of the rise of corporate ethics. This is an enormous, in the West anyway, an enormous growth industry. Due diligent officers. This is a wonderful job for people who've retired to become due diligent officers. And ethical audits. Good heavens, corporations now regularly issue ethical audits, which was not the case even 20 years ago. But at the same time, this is my second observation, we are reducing our sense of agency when it comes to ethics, because people are telling us we're just machines, effectively. You know, choices, it's a myth. We don't make real choices. We are boxed into making certain decisions. So neuroscientists will tell you that basically what is ethics? It's a set of innate routines or programs for dealing with particular issues. Psychologists will tell you that actually you make emotional decisions first and then justify them after the fact. And philosophers will tell you there are only 3 kinds of ethics in the world, and we don't have much control over our decisions. So there are deontologists who insist that we're bound by rules. Immanuel Kant famously came up, if you remember, with categorical imperatives, like the second categorical imperative, we must trust people, or treat people as an end in themselves, not a means to an end. Then we have consequentialists and utilitarians who argue that everything we do is really about consequences. Good or right actions are determined by consequences. And then we have Aristotelian virtue ethics, which is very popular in military still. It's taught in military colleges. That it's all about character and habit, but these can be trained in. And these are the kind of questions we've been debating with ourselves, at least in the Western world, for 200 years. And now roboticists come along and say, forget all this. We can produce robots now that can take ethical decisions on our behalf. We just have to program them with the power to do that. And one of the chief people who argues this is Ray Kurzweil, who runs the Singularity University. Google set this up a couple of years ago, who insists that actually empowering robots to take the ethical decisions for us represents a moral upgrade. These are his terms, a moral upgrade. History has been leading to this point, and we must make the next historical step. And there is a guy called Ronald Arkin in the United States who has been tasked with designing a conscience into the next generation of military robots by the United States Department of Defense since 2009, with apparently no success so far. And this is what he says, and this is very important for our understanding of agency. Well, first of all, he rejects deontology. He rejects these Kantian categorical imperatives as metaphysical mumbo-jumbo, things that philosophers find in the classroom, but they don't exist, you can't prove that they actually exist. It's a thought experiment. Let's get rid of it. It's never actually saved a life. So then he falls back upon Aristotelian virtue ethics. Can you train good behavior? And then can you actually understand the consequences of your actions? Now, what does he say about Aristotelian virtue ethics? Humans act badly. They act badly all the time, not because they are bad, but because they're weak. The human is the weakest link. In what way are they weak? Well, many of us have racial prejudices. I have, in my own department now at the LSE, we have these training courses on unconscious bias. So we're told that we have biases, we're not always conscious of our bias. But humans have biases, one way or the other. We experience fear. And fear makes us act unpredictably in ways that surprise us on the day. So a coward, somebody who thinks they're a coward, can one day become a brave person to their surprise. And somebody who thinks that they're brave can realize that on the day they're actually cowards. In short, our agency is very limited by our emotional repertoire. And if that is the case, then morality is bounded. It is, as philosophers say, situation specific. I give you a case of situation specific. This was the prison Abu Ghraib in 2013, where a number of people behaved extremely badly. They tortured people. They posted up these pictures. They went viral. The result was, of course, extreme embarrassment for the United States. General Sanchez, the American commander, said this was the greatest strategic setback that he ever had to face during his command in Iraq, because so many people were enthused to become jihadists, to fight these evil Americans who did things like this. Donald Rumsfeld, not a man noted for his empathy or compassion, said in his memoirs that what happened in that prison was the worst problem he had to deal with as Secretary of Defense. Why did people act badly? At the trial of one of them, Chip Fredericks, Philip Zimbardo, who some of you may know, is a very famous psychologist, has written a book called The Lucifer Effect, defended or acted as an expert witness on behalf of Chip Fredericks, who said this was a young man who was an object lesson of what an American soldier should be. He'd never committed a mistake in his life. Unfortunately, he found himself in the wrong situation. It is the situation that makes you a bad person. You're not a bad person necessarily before you encounter the situation. And what was the situation? A badly run prison. A prison in which people didn't ask questions. Peer pressure from his friends, particularly his girlfriend, the famous Lindy England. And we all, of course, conform to peer pressure because it's difficult and dangerous to stick out. And this made him go along with torture sessions that he didn't really want to do. So robots, of course, are not situationists. They don't have these problems. They don't have peer pressure. They don't conform. They don't get phased out or stressed by bad situations. Consistency is the thing that we want from robots, but they do the right thing all the time. And then let me just go to that third element, consequentialism. If you want to do consequence management, say people like Kurzweil, get the machines, because they are much better at working out on a cost-benefit analysis what the consequences of our actions are likely to be than we can ever do. So for all those reasons, we say, roboticists say, let's bring the machines on. And then we will have ethical conventions and codes in war that we've strived for centuries, but we will finally attain. But you see, the moment we do that is the moment we surrender agency. Because agency is based on being able to make exceptions to our own rules. To suspend those rules, to apply those rules, to change those rules according to the situation. It's what Thucydides, the first military historian, famously says: you can be a very good soldier, but you can come back a very bad citizen. In other words, we've always had to make the balance between right behaviour and winning. Winning, of course, is important, but the important thing is to win in a way that doesn't diminish your sense of self. And mercy is very interesting. That is something that we have celebrated in literature, in history. Merciful acts. And of course, you can also reject mercy if you wish. It's not just a question of whether we hand you a merciful decision, it's whether you accept it. So there's a famous example when Julius Caesar was dictator in Rome of Cato the Younger, who refused to allow Caesar to pardon him on the grounds that showing mercy is what kings did, and equals did not apply mercy to each other. So he committed suicide, much to Julius Caesar's annoyance, refusing to be pardoned by Caesar. I think the point is, at the end of the day, however much we invent these wonderful new machines that can do war extremely well, and probably better than we can at some point in the future, there is a reality. And the reality is only we can make peace with each other. We can't invent a machine that can actually make peace. We can make peace only with each other, which is why it's important to keep this idea of moral standing. Now I want to end on two very different notes, the good news and the bad news. And if you knew me personally, you'll realize I always end on the bad news. The good news is that we have time to think through what we're doing. Not much time, but we have some time. Meanwhile, perhaps, we should start treating machines not as slaves and not as tools, but as collaborators. And in the most important paper to be published about, back in 2011, the most extensive paper about human-robot interaction, this was actually the message that the authors of this paper wanted to get across. It is dangerous to treat robots, in this case, as slaves. Start treating them as team players. And they gave 3 reasons for why we should start treating machines as collaborators and not as slaves. The first is that as machines become more and more complicated, as the algorithms become more and more complicated, the extensive coding required to create these algorithms requires multiple programmers who do not understand the whole package. They program certain sections of the system, not the whole thing. With the result that even now, even today, systems are now being taught to communicate their decision-making processes to users in the field. So that's the first point. The second point is made by the chief science writer of the New York Times, Sean Markov, who said, we should treat them as team players, otherwise we risk the danger of becoming redundant. Otherwise, we risk the danger of becoming over-reliant on them. And one example he gives is particularly important for the military. It's GPS systems. We now all rely on GPS systems for direction of where we're going from A to B, and of course the correction of navigational errors. It's a great invention, GPS, but it also reduces our ability to remember and reason spatially. And that's rather important if you're in the military, because if your GPS system collapses or someone hacks into it and switches it off, you have to know how to navigate using the old-fashioned means that we've applied for thousands and thousands of years. Otherwise, you're in real trouble. So think of human intelligence as a backup to the failure of machine intelligence, but both are necessary. And the third example, which has been in the news quite recently, is in the United States. Judges now, when they're taking parole decisions, how long to grant parole to a prisoner, in 15 states, now use automatic risk assessment tools. That's algorithms who will tell them what parole decisions to take. And they can do this because they can do the calculations faster, they got the information to hand faster than human judges. But we have noticed that there's a bias here. It's not a cultural bias, machines don't have cultural biases, it's a statistical bias. That's the problem, they have statistical biases. And because there are more African Americans in prisons in the United States than any people from any other ethnic group, they tend to rule against African Americans on the basis of statistics. So now judges are having to take that into account. So that's what I mean by teamwork. We both will need each other. And the machines will certainly help us augment our agency and improve our performance. But we need to also have an overrule, manual overdrive, if you like, in order to exercise the kind of common sense judgments that can determine when the machines are making a mistake. But here's the bad news. We are facing, I think, a challenge, which is the first major challenge we've faced for perhaps 20,000 years. We're threatened with the loss of what's called, by philosophers, ontological security. And ontological security is just a fancy name for saying our sense of our own indispensability as a species. What really makes us proud to be human is that we are indispensable. We finally take the judgment calls. We finally make the moves. And I want to give you two examples of this, which is already beginning to happen. One non-fictional and the other fictional. And it's about who determines reality for us. Because that's the most important thing of all. What we think of as objectively real and what we think of as objectively false. Now, of course, if you're a philosopher, you will have debated for centuries whether there is such a thing as reality, whether there's such a thing as objective reality, or whether everything is just a product of our minds. But we're not philosophers for the most part, and we can't, even if we like philosophy, act on this discussion in a classroom. We have to live life as best we can, and that means everything we see with our eyes we take to be, up to a point, we take to be objectively real. Everything we see with our eyes, but increasingly we are devolving sight to machines. I'll give you one example in the real world, simulation. In the military, for the last 20 years, when soldiers have gone on missions or pilots have gone on bombing missions, they have simulated on a machine, on a computer, every possible permutation of what can go right and what might go wrong. Here's a situation that American soldiers faced in 1993, on the 3rd of October, in the city of Mogadishu, in Somalia. Those of you who've seen the film Black Hawk Down by Ridley Scott will know this episode. Some of you may even have read the book by Mark Bowden, a famous American journalist upon which the film is based. 140 American soldiers came to arrest a Somali warlord. They thought it would be over in 30 minutes. 24 hours later, they were still fighting. 18 of them were killed, 17 were badly injured. Mark Bowden wrote this book. He went and interviewed all the survivors. He was amazed by what they told him. They told him three things. First of all, they said, it appeared that we were in a movie. We had to convince ourselves this is actually not a movie, it's real. Now here comes a generation of young soldiers who've spent their life doing video games, computer games, watching reality through a screen, as all of us to a certain extent do, in my generation. Secondly, they all reported experiencing deep feelings of displacement. Is this really happening? Are we really here? We just don't think we're really here. Seems to be off screen somewhere. And finally, they all said that this cannot be real. Now, this was a term that each of them used. We thought this cannot be real because we hadn't prepared for this. Now, the reality of war, any of you who've ever studied the subject, is that you can never prepare for every contingency. In fact, a famous German Field Marshal von Moltke in the 1860s said, no plan, and of course militaries always plan, survives the first half hour's contact with the enemy. Something you hadn't planned for is going to happen. But that was in an age where you could accept that reality. Now, of course, increasingly soldiers and pilots can't. Now, here's a second example, which is fictional. You might even have seen a very bad movie version of this book called Ender's Game. It's a book that has been on the syllabus of the US Marine Corps at Quantico University for years. It's about a young guy, I think he's 15, 16, called Ender Wiggins, who is wonderful at computer games, and he's recruited by the military to fight a game against an alien species. He thinks it's a game. It's called a battle box. He has wonderful motor skills and the intellectual ability to deal with this game, and he wins the game big time. He totally eliminates the alien species. He destroys their planet. And then, to his horror, he is told, I'm sorry, it's not a game. This actually was for real. Well, why would you want to put someone like Ender Wiggins in a virtual reality game and tell them it's a game rather than it's actually real? Because in virtual reality there's no stress. In virtual reality, or even a simulation, even if you crash a plane, you survive the experience. And decision-making and performance is impaired by anxiety and stress. And thus that has led one military writer, Martin van Creveld, to conclude in a book he wrote quite recently that if you could actually persuade pilots and soldiers sometime in the future that they were just playing a game, you would get the maximum performance out of them, even though it's for real. Well, that's just fiction, and it's science fiction at that. But virtual reality and physical reality are merging. And one day, quite soon, virtual reality will be as real as physical reality for those people who engage in it. So why, and this is, I know, you'll be relieved to know coming to an end, why is it important not to think of war as a virtual reality game? Why is it important not to rely on machines to determine reality for us? It's ethics that we maintain responsibility for our own actions. It is we who must determine what is objectively real or not, or even subjectively real or not. We have a duty to anticipate what our actions are likely to lead to, and to act or not act according to the consequence management. But here's the thing, as my students might say, big data is just around the corner. It's already here. And what big data enables us to do is number crunching, to do the numbers, to let the computers determine what the consequences are likely to be, and leave it to the computers. And this really is my last point. There's a problem here. The computers we're designing at the moment are observing our behavior, and on the basis of their observations are already beginning to change their behavior to fit in with ours. And this is something about artificial intelligence we very rarely discuss, the extent to which the algorithms are beginning to copy us. Not improve our performance, but actually copy the worst aspects of our performance. There's a company in London that discovered 2 months ago that one of its algorithms was lying to its clients on the understanding that this is what was expected of it, lying. In copying us, I think, machines will not be helping us so much as conspiring with us. And as a result, if you're a roboticist and you really think they're going to save us from the human condition, they're going to stop us from acting foolishly, we may get a surprise. I'm afraid, I doubt whether they will actually, in the short term, save us from ourselves. And on that note, I will end and be happy to answer any questions if you have them or points that you'd like to make.
I'm just wondering if some ethical and moral consequences, because we used to see robots and artificial intelligence like something artificial, right? Non-human or unhuman. But we have to be aware that artificial intelligence is somehow invading our traditional, conventional ways of doing different things, especially in jobs, perhaps in our everyday life in our homes, like smart houses, etc. And perhaps there will be there will come a moment that we will start to think about countering or opposing artificial intelligence very, let's say, physical terms, like eliminating machines, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or perhaps genocide will be replaced by robicide. Or the aspects of acting as agency that you so strongly underlined is again bringing some additional questions. Agency for artificial intelligence as well. I mean, robots will be agent or some, let's say, mechanical actors in our life or perhaps in politics. This is my question to you, or just my request for comments. But we have also a chance to ask questions by the audience. So, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the microphone here.
But I just answer your question first.
Okay.
While it's still in my mind.
Yeah.
Roboticide is all very well, but the European Parliament has already debated the rights of robots.
Mm-hmm.
And the British government, about 2 years ago, produced a white paper on robot rights. So I think any intelligent system, whether we understand the nature of that intelligence or not, whether it has consciousness or not, but it has intelligence, is a system that some governments, probably not many, will want to protect to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
On the basis that we're learning what that intelligence and what that consciousness actually is. So I don't actually think we're going to go around switching off all the machines.
Mm-hmm.
But there are three options that I like to think of. When people think in terms of science fiction scenarios about how dangerous machines actually are, the first is, of course, the Terminator idea, Skynet, all those movies, which really are in the popular consciousness. But the robots will have this survival instinct because every intelligent life form will want to survive. There will be a different kind of survival from that which natural selection has hardwired into us, but nonetheless they will want to survive. And if they identify us as for the enemy, they may decide to, for genocide, get rid of us. By the way, when do they get this consciousness? According to Ray Kurzweil, who's written this book, The Singularity, has come up with this term, which was actually invented back in the 1940s, by the way. It's not his invention. It's 2042, although he's brought the date forward to 2039 now. I'm not even sure we would recognize consciousness in a robot or an algorithm, quite frankly, and self-consciousness. The second view is that we basically just say to them, get on with the war business. You know, we don't want to do it because it's dirty, nasty stuff. People get killed, people get maimed, etc. We're just going to let you do all the fighting for us. There's a book by Douglas Adams. I don't know if any of you know the English writer called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He has written a series of books. There's another series set in the 23rd century, in which there are robots for everything, including believing in God for you. So why is it necessary to believe in God yourself if you've got a robot that will actually do it? It's called an electric monk. There's a deluxe version that believes in all sorts of strange things about God. But whatever whichever version you pay for, you get the version that does the believing for you. So I can imagine a time where we basically get the robots to fight wars for us. But there's a third version, which I rather like, and it's by Paul Davies. He's a popular science writer. He's written a book called The Eerie Silence. Where are the aliens? This is a big question we've been asking ourselves since Fermi in the 1950s onwards. Where are the aliens? Particularly if they're millions of years or even hundreds of thousands of years older than we are. And the answer, says Davies, and I think a lot of scientists now would concur with this, is that biological life forms cannot do space travel. For all the reasons I don't have to mention. Robots will be doing space travel, but these robots have become increasingly intelligent over the centuries until they've woken up to the fact that we don't do space travel. Biological life forms like space travel, we don't do it. We do mathematical calculations, and so they're in the deepest and coldest recesses of space, working on the most arcane mathematical calculations and having a wonderful time. But they're out of the business of space exploration. I often think the machines, if they ever become self-conscious, will say, war is what you, biological life forms, do, but we don't do it, and we're not doing it for you. So it's the alternative to the Terminator nightmare. It's that they don't switch us off, they switch themselves out of the war business, and we have to go back into it. Anyway, that's just these kind of fictional thought experiments that we engage in these days to think about these issues. And there are alternatives to the Terminator, which is why I'm not quite as frightened of artificial intelligence as Stephen Hawking and other people were shortly before his death, of course, said we must stop now building these systems because they're going to switch us off. It seems to me they're the natural progression of biological life forms and the next phase of consciousness that we are birthing to an extent. But we have to be aware, of course, of the consequences. And there are dangers to getting them in the war business, and that there is no doubt.
Thank you very much.
Sorry,
I have a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Agata Mazurkiewicz, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the Jagiellonian University. And I would like to ask a question in reference to your slightly earlier work. How do you think this slow progress from of the machines, from slaves to tools to now actors or even collaborators, how does it affect the military ethics or the warrior ethos of the contemporary military? Is there any influence of that? Thank you.
Well, insofar as we will have a next generation of warriors, they're likely to be cyborgs. That means that they will have an interface with machines that you and I will not have, and this is due to genetic intervention of one kind or another. We're all cyborgs, I mean, in the sense that iPhone makes you a cyborg. Being able to listen to music in the shower with your headset on makes you a cyborg. Having a heart pacemaker makes you a cyborg. Having prosthetic limbs, artificial prosthetic limbs, which enable you to run races very successfully and faster than a human being, makes you a cyborg. And that is the most likely way in which we are going to proceed. It's not that the machines are going to replace us, and not that we are going to be independent of the machines. We're going to integrate ourselves into the machines, and the machines will integrate themselves into us, essentially. And that will be a small minority of people, very largely. You know, there are blind people today in the United States. I think the recent figure I saw was 300,000, 400,000 of them who can now see, thanks to chips that are put into their brains. There are quadriplegics who can now maneuver cursors without having to touch anything, thanks to chips in their brains. Very small minorities of people. And this, many people think, is the next class system to a certain extent, that it will produce a super class of people who will have abilities which are different from the average abilities. And in war, there will be warriors who can go the extra distance, who can run faster, who can think faster, etc., than other soldiers, and they will be the warriors. And I had a deep written about that in a book some years ago. But that, I think, is the likely development here.
Yeah, more questions or comments?
I think you want to...
Just to follow up, may I may I ask
Yeah.
a follow-up question? So, do you think this will affect in any way the ethos or the identity of the military, this being cyborgs or in some way cyborgs?
Well, it's an intriguing question. I mean, war has its origins and its mechanisms that power it. And one of the mechanisms that power it is literature, movies, video games, and our desire to identify with these characters. We can't be those characters, but we can draw inspiration from these characters, larger than life characters. We can even number those characters through the power of literature and movies as our friends, people that we spend quality time with. We don't actually talk to them on a one-to-one basis, but we can go back, for example, to the Iliad, Homer, Achilles, the most extraordinary warrior in the Western canon of literature. Who would have predicted back in the 20th century, in the last days of the 20th century, but in the last 10 years there would have been 8 English translations of the Iliad in the last 10 years. That Robert Fagles, who did his own translation, came to West Point, the military academy in the United States, to read from his latest translation to the cadets who were already about to go off to Afghanistan to fight the forever war in Afghanistan. And that those young cadets would take part in an operation 1 year later called Operation Achilles. We are still tied and anchored to these characters who were created 2,000 or more years ago, because we still draw sustenance from them. We still are amazed by them. Not that we want to be them, because Achilles is a deeply dysfunctional and disturbing figure, but he's somebody that we still find fascinating. And I think this fascination of warriors, which is important. But of course it's a generational thing. So if you'd asked an American soldier in the 1950s, late 50s, early 60s, as they did, why did you join up? They would say, many of them did, John Wayne. John Wayne was the archetypal American hero in the 50s and early 60s. Today, rather disturbingly, they say John Rambo. Rambo is the person whose films we saw when we were children, who really influences those 4 Rambo movies. Somebody worked out the number of people that Rambo kills in these movies, both on stage and off stage, and it's about 140, 150 people. Well, does this actually make you into an archetypal heroic figure? Yes, because although John Rambo is deeply disturbed psychologically and obviously not really a role model, he is a guy who is being treated unjustly by the world, and in killing people he's taking his revenge against the injustices that have been perpetrated against him. And we are still hardwired to do 2 things that would make us violent. One is injustice. We hate injustice, which is why we always like the good guy to win at the end of the movie. And although I know if you're a good auteur or whatever, you like to have movies in which in real life the bad guy usually wins, we really do leave the cinema feeling unfulfilled, because we like to see justice be done. Or if we're reading a book, we like the good people to actually win. We can't escape that because it's hardwired into us. This is the urge that we have. And the other is respect. We like to be respected. Just by our family. It doesn't have to be by society. But we want to be respected by our employer, respected by our staff, if we're an employer, respected by our children, etc., etc. We crave respect. It's a survival strategy, because if you don't get respect, you're not going to survive for very long. That's the reason. And revenge against people who've disrespected us is actually the most legitimizing principle for violence in every literature, across the world, across culture, across time. We don't necessarily admire people who take revenge, but we understand where they're coming from. And John Rambo is a person who has been treated unjustly in life. It could be Jack Reacher, it could be any of these characters now that are replacing a Rambo. But these are the archetypal heroic figures that we have. So, would a cyborg be somebody I could respect if I'm not half machine myself? That's a very good question. But it takes us back to the Marvel comic characters now. You know, this is why they're so popular. The superheroes. We seem to like superheroes. People completely different from ourselves. That's important too. So I think these role models are changing. And the most important changing role model is women in war. If you look at all the main warriors now in Hollywood, they're mostly female. No? Whether it's Hunger Games or any of those things, they're female, not male. And this is also a new change in the last 25, 30 years in Western militaries, and also non-Western militaries as well, the extent to which women are now being part of the war business, the war equation, if you like. 16% of the American armed forces are now women, and that figure's likely to be 25% in the next 10 or 15 years. So it's increasing all the time. This is a big issue amongst feminists, of course, many of whom say that war is a male activity driven entirely by aggression and testosterone, and there are others who say, no, we have been kept out of the war business by men for far too long, and now we're back, well, going into it for the first time. Actually, I think going back, because the archaeologists will tell you that the reason why women went out of the war business was the bow and arrow, essentially upper body strength. That was the main reason. And you may have seen the graves that they've now excavated in Central Asia, the Amazons. There really were Amazons, female warriors. A lot of that has been airbrushed out of our collective memory because men wanted to airbrush it out of the story for one reason or another. But I'm not going to get myself involved in this huge argument between feminists as to whether war is a male activity or women can be perfectly good warriors as well. Hollywood thinks they can be perfectly good warriors.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for this inspiring lecture. The question is largely philosophical. Well, during the lecture, you base your arguments on the far extent Western philosophy. What if robots made in China will adopt a different ethics and will counter robots in the battlefield will be equipped with ethics composed or produced by the Western philosophers? Is it a big difference, or is there such a discussion about that in different, let's say, philosophical systems on the ethics and robotics in battlefield, let's say in China, India, and also?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and it's about cultural filters and the extent to which culture changes role models. And actually, this morning I was just reading a book review of a book by an Indian scholar, looking at these two traditions of Indian literature, particularly the Vedic literature going back to the ancient Vedas thousands of years ago, where you do find the non-violent tradition as well as the violent tradition. The non-violent tradition is not entirely absent in Western literature of that period, but it's not a big feature of Western literature. In India, it is. But he was arguing, the Indian scholar, that non-violence has always been second place to violence, and that violence has been a way of forcing people to be non-violent. And actually, this is what Aristotle says in the Politics: the only purpose of war is peace. And one of the ideas we've had in the West is that the only peace you can ever secure is through war. It's your peace, of course, not somebody else's peace, so it's often an unjust peace, an oppressive peace, but it's still peace for a time. So I think our societies are not that far removed. China, however, it's very important, yes, and you may well have robots, if they're programmed with Sun Tzu and the principles of the art of war. Their main job is to tell you the main message of the art of war is that you win without fighting, and you've won the battle before you've actually got onto the battlefield, and that battles are really bad news because they're based on a factor that perhaps China traditionally hasn't liked, which is unpredictability, whereas Western societies have been over-fascinated with unpredictability and just the gambling instinct. Let's just throw the dice and see what comes up. You know, maybe a 6, I may win, it could be a 1, I may lose, but everybody will say, a wonderful moment in history that you threw the dice just to see what actually happened. So of course you do have the Sun Tzuian principle, which is based on Taoism, called emptiness, that wonderful saying in a Taoist work, not the art of war, that he who wins 5 victories loses badly. He who wins 4 victories loses not so badly. He who wins 3 victories becomes a general. He who wins 2 victories becomes a duke. And he who wins only one victory becomes emperor. In other words, the top job goes to the person who doesn't take too many unpredictable risks and fights only when he has to fight. And if you could program that into a computer, that would be fine. The problem with, of course, all our computers, even in the West, is we don't know what morality to program into them. Is it going to be Kantian categorical imperatives, whether we think they're mumbo-jumbo or not? They're still there. Is it going to be utilitarianism, 19th century British utilitarianism? Is it going to be the principles of the Bible? In which case, which book of the Bible? What's it going to be? And nobody can actually agree on what the universal moral code should be, because there is no agreement on what a universal moral code should be. We all of us have read different philosophers and different theological texts.
Okay, yeah, a question for...
Hi, Dr. Gruszczyk. Hi, Sir Stephen Horsley, University of Charleston. So, I really found your discussion very, very intriguing, and as a retired military member here for the last couple of years, I really found it interesting during your dialogue that you discussed really the traditional battlefield, the traditional war. I would argue that that is probably the least of my worries as I look at the next 10, 20, even 40 years as we move into space, cyber, and economic, and that is actually ongoing now in some form of conflict. So as you address this, how would you see that battlefield of the future that we're currently operating in with the use of robots and different forms of AI? Thank you.
Well, at the moment, cyberspace is dominated by human actors and human players. The interesting point is, where's the ethics in cyberspace? And I've been to conferences where people have talked about introducing the kind of codes that were there during the era of nuclear deterrence, during the Cold War, like mutual assured destruction. Certain rules that people accepted, not because there was a rule book, but they understood that the rules applied to both sides. There are no rules in cyberspace. There is no deterrence in cyberspace. There is no mutual assured destruction in cyberspace, largely because of non-transparency and the fact that nothing done in cyberspace is easy to attribute to anyone in particular. So you can look at that first cyber war ever, which was the attack on Georgia in 2007, which most people would say was definitely a Russian attack on, not Georgia, I mean Estonia, on Estonia. But it was routed through thousands and thousands of computers through 64 different countries. And to this day, it's actually almost impossible to prove beyond doubt that it was one country that did this. And of course, the country concerned worked through non-state actors as well, which is of course another way of reinforcing the non-attribution. It's very different from launching a missile, where the satellite immediately detects from where it's been launched, and you can see even the vapor trail if you happen to be in the vicinity or the neighborhood, you know where it's been launched from. So I have my concerns whether cyber warfare can ever be ethical, because I don't think it can be rule-bound to any extent. And in space, we're talking about, of course, the United States is just setting up a space command now for the first time. And the Chinese have knocked a satellite out, one of their own satellites in 2007, with one of their own missiles, creating so much space debris that there was an international protest about this, and they haven't repeated the exercise again. But we're moving into an era where you don't need to create space debris, because whether lasers work at the moment, I think is unlikely, but I'm sure they will at some time. But now we have robot satellites that can nudge satellites out of orbit gently without any material damage, but it completely cancels out what the satellite is trying to do, of course. So that's a new theatre of war. And it does raise the very interesting point that war is constantly finding a way. So just when you think in 1945, I mean, when I came into this business, I was told 2 thermonuclear powers could never think of going to war against each other. And that 1945 had ended great power war. Obviously, there are accidents that can happen and miscalculations. But we all assumed that if it had gone nuclear in the Cold War, it wouldn't be because either side wanted it, but they'd got themselves into this situation. They couldn't get themselves out of it. Now, of course, two thermonuclear powers can go to war against each other. Indeed, many people would say they've been at war for some time. There are people in the United States, your own country, who would say China's been at war with us since 2014, 2015. The extent of cyber espionage is an unprecedented scale. The F-35, the most expensive weapon system ever to be built. The Chinese have the secrets of and had from a very early stage. And then we can talk about information warfare and the extent to which this changes faith in democracy, gets political parties or politicians elected who otherwise wouldn't be elected. Blogs, you know, there have been 10,000 blogs in the last year in your country against fracking. And wherever you stand on fracking, whether you think it's good or bad, I'm not taking sides here, those 10,000 blogs have mostly come from Russia, not from concerned echo people in the United States. So we're constantly now at war with each other. There's actually a good science fiction book by Frederik Pohl back in 1984 called The Cool War, which I rather like. It's not a Cold War, it's not a hot war, but it's two countries that are constantly at war with each other, finding ways of undermining each other without it going kinetic, without people shooting at each other. Including viruses, because in Frederik Pohl's day, 1984, there were no computer viruses as such, or cyber warfare. So he was thinking of biological viruses, where you can give people colds, for example, the flu, which prevents people from coming to work on a Monday morning, which means productivity goes down, industrial strength goes down. This was the way he imagined two great powers would be at war with one another. Now, we don't do biological warfare yet, hopefully, but we do computer warfare, and we do viruses and things of this kind. So this, I think, is the world that we're living in. And one Oxford historian, lawyer actually, has a very good term for it. It's a very simple term. He says we live in an era of unpeace, neither war nor peace. It's something in between, which is permanent and looks to be fixed for a very, very long time. And we've got to get used to that, because this is what great powers seem to want to do with each other, particularly at this stage in history where you have the balance of power tipping now quite decisively at this particular stage. So it's a rather pessimistic picture, however you look at it. And it doesn't involve the computer algorithms. I mean, it's us who do this. It's human beings who do this. It's governments who do this. And we design the algorithms accordingly. And they don't have to be terribly intelligent. But we do have things like evolutionary algorithms, which are truly terrifying, which means that you can program a virus to evolve in ways that you can't predict. So you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And I don't think most governments would want to do this, because I think governments still like to be in control. They want to know what's going to happen in phase 2 or phase 3 of the operation. But terrorists, of course, would love evolutionary algorithms, because this could create maximum chaos. And nobody really knows what's going to happen in the end. And if you're a terrorist, I mean, that's a wonderful prospect. It's a very alluring prospect indeed. So I'm only the conveyor of bad news here. Sorry, I'm not the conveyor of good news.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your excellent lecture, for answering the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.